it isn't obvious to me at all that your theory of identity is going to serve the function that you assume it is. It's not psychologically sophisticated enough. It's not sociologically sophisticated enough. You can't insist that other people play a game that they don't know how to play, especially when you also don't know how to play it, except to say that it exists.
Jordan Peterson engages in a fiery discussion on pronouns and free speech. The clash of ideas between him and fellow professors unfolds.
Every massive conflict of ideas, let's say, manifests itself in the minute. And that's why it's often difficult to gain any headway, because no matter where you draw the line, it's arbitrary and subject to criticism. And, the fact that this happens to be about gender-neutral pronouns regarding transgender people, to me, is just more or less an accident. It could have been about almost any number of other things. But I would also like to suggest that what should have happened with what I did was that nothing, right? I made some videos that I'm a relatively obscure academic, and I made some videos in my private time that were, pretty badly produced because they're just amateur. And I was trying to straighten out my thinking about a couple of issues, the anti-unconscious bias training, for example, and also this legislative mess. And obviously it struck a major chord. And that, to me, is indication that my original supposition was correct, and that there was far more going on under the surface than there was at the surface. I mean, like I said, it's very difficult to pick the proper level of analysis, but one of the ways you justify your choice is by observing the impact of your choice of level of analysis and seeing if the consequences are commensurate with your original hypothesis. And I thought, well, just because people say they're doing one thing with a piece of legislation doesn't mean that that's what they're doing. And of course, a piece of legislation is a hydra. In any case, it does all sorts of things that people don't intend it to do.
In a heated exchange, Jordan Peterson questions the consequences of complying with mandatory pronoun use and the potential for manipulation. The debate touches on personal identity, free speech, and political correctness.
There's all these pronouns that have come up. There's 70 different sets of pronouns approximately to hypothetically describe people who don't fit anywhere on the gender spectrum, which is also something that I don't really understand. I don't understand that conceptually.
We'll come to that.
Yeah, but the point is, okay, so now a person is compelled under Canadian law to use the pronoun of another individual's choice on pain of law. And I thought, well, no, that's not acceptable. It's one thing to put limits on what a person can't say, like say with hate speech laws, which I also don't agree with, by the way, but that's a different argument. I think it's a narrower argument. But to compel me to use a certain content when I'm formulating my thoughts or my actions under threat of legislative action, I thought, no, what's happened there is the government has introduced compelled speech legislation into the private sphere. It's never happened in the history of English common law. And so I said, there's no way I'm abiding by that. I don't care what your damn rationale is. We're compassionate. It's like, no, you're not. No, you're not. You're playing this radical collectivist left-wing game. You're trying to gain linguistic supremacy in the area of public discourse. You're doing that using compassion as a guise, and you're pulling the wool over people's eyes. And you're not going to do it with me.
Gender ideological related pronoun usage, in personal conversation, I told the the Canadian Senate that would cause enough confusion to produce a psychological epidemic among young women, because the literature on that's quite clear going back several hundred years. And I think you can make a pretty strong case, and you do this to some degree in your book in Chapter 7, that there are few more fundamental perceptual categories than male and female. I think that category system might be as fundamental as up or down, or black and white, or light and dark. Those would be the only ones that I can think of that are at the same depth of cognitive necessity, perceptual necessity. One of the things that people tend to think when they think casually is that if you have more choice, you have more freedom, and more choice and more freedom is always good. But the problem with that is that a plethora of choice, so excess choice, excess option, produces not freedom but anxiety, because there's only a limited amount of information that you can deal with at any given moment. And if people are put in a situation where everything is up for grabs. They're not free, they're terrified. And that's part of the reason, as far as I can tell, why rates of depression and anxiety among young people have skyrocketed in recent years, especially among young women, who are also the ones who are most likely to fall prey to psychological epidemics in general, and the one that we're in now specifically. You have all these students, the ones that you just laid out, they vary in their attitude towards their self-professed gender, from the ones who are grandstanding to some degree, let's say, to the ones that are very serious. And you have to make a judgment in the moment that is dependent on the variables that present themselves in a very complex way in that situation. And I understand why you took the pathway that you took, and it's perfectly reasonable to do so. My point was that you don't minimize all the errors by doing so. It's fine. It's still a fine way of approaching. It isn't. My point was that because of my psychological acumen, I would say that the experience that I've derived is that I would be comfortable in making the judgment and taking the consequential risk. I'm not saying I'd be correct. That's not the same thing at all. I'm willing to suffer the consequences of my error. That's not the same thing as being right. And so if I feel that a student is manipulating me, then I'm not going to go along with it. Now, I might be wrong about that and actually hurt someone who's genuinely asking for something that they need. But I'm also, what would you say, sensitive to the error of allowing manipulation to go unchecked.
Professor Peterson defends his stance against compelled language use, citing concerns over free speech and government overreach. His opponent argues for respecting human rights and urges kindness in addressing pronoun preferences. This intense conversation delves into the heart of linguistic freedom and social responsibility.
We've accepted this preposterous hypothesis that your identity is only subjectively defined. And as I've tried to point out on some of my lectures, the only people who think their identity is subjectively defined are 2-year-olds. And I mean that technically, because 2-year-olds are egocentric, which means they can't bring their identity in alignment with a social norm, which also means that 2-year-olds can't play with other children. They can play beside them, but they can't play with them. That doesn't happen until you're 3. What happens when you're 3, if you're reasonably well socialized or start to move towards that, is that you learn how to negotiate a social identity. And then identity becomes, obviously it has some roots in your subjectivity and in your biology for that matter, but a sophisticated identity is not only socially negotiated, as the constructivists know perfectly well, but it's got a dynamism about it because it has to be constantly renegotiated. Like, as we're having a conversation here, to some degree, we're renegotiating our mutual identities because we learn something from each other. Right. So we transform. Right. We're also trying to figure out to some degree who each of us is in this situation. And then we're also trying to learn, can we play together towards some productive end? And you might ask, well, what do you mean play? And say, well, we're trying to have an interesting conversation. That's a form of play.
If I was sitting here in front of you as a transgendered male to female or female to male, and we began the conversation, at the beginning of the conversation, you stumbled and called me he or she, and I was perhaps identifying the other way around. And then if I'd said to you, please, I'd rather go by she, how would you respond to that on a personal level? How would you?
Well, it would depend on the situation, but the way I have responded to that, because I've had a number of conversations with transgendered individuals, is that I use whatever pronoun seems to go along with the persona that they're projecting publicly. It's the simplest thing to do. Now, if you would respect their choice on an individual level. Yeah. But with a more contentious pronouns, je and je, and that sort of thing, that's a whole different issue. Because the question there is, well, exactly what is it that you're doing when you're asking me to use those words? Like, are you compelling me to play your particular ideological game, or is this actually a matter of some personal identity that's important to you? And those things are not obvious. And so in a situation like that, the first thing I'd have to do is to try to figure out just exactly what was going on in the situation, and that's not simple. And so there would be no foregone conclusion that I would address you by the pronouns of your choice. The first thing I'd want to find out is that just a narcissistic power play? Because that's actually the most likely outcome.
Close crosstalk between Ontario and the federal government because the Liberals are in power in both, and the radical end of the Liberal Party is in power in both situations. And it turns out that it's illegal for, like, you're liable as an employer, for example, if any of your employees say anything that can be construed as harassment, say on the grounds of sexual or gender identity, even if what they say has unintended consequences, and even if you don't know that they said it. And so that kind of legislation, I just think, is just absolutely reprehensible. And then because it's designed to cast the broadest possible net, catch the most fish, and it's clearly being implemented by people who are not precisely pro-employer, let's put it that way. And then there's another little ugly secret hidden underneath the policies, and that's manifest most clearly in the form of what's come to be known as the gender unicorn, which I would recommend that you look up, which is an animated character designed to indoctrinate small children into the social constructionist worldview, which claims that biological sex, gender identity, gender expression, and sexual proclivity vary independently, which they most certainly do not. Now, and that's what I said in the video. That's partly why I've been accused of, say, being a transphobe. And I also complained that the university was taking policy advice from the people who started Black Lives Matter. And I don't have anything against Black Lives Matter particularly, but the two people who started it are not the sorts of individuals, let's say, that the university should be basing its policy decisions. The advice, they shouldn't be taking advice from those people with regards to their policy. And apparently that makes me a racist. So the first part of the argument about what happened with my videos was actually whether or not I was racist and transphobic and all of that. But the point that I was making, the specific technical point, was that the claim that those four phenomena vary independently was just patently false. And it is, by any reasonable definition of false. And I know that it's part of a much broader propaganda exercise, as evidenced by the gender unicorn, for example, which gets children to indicate on 4 sliders their sex assigned at birth, their gender identity, their gender expression, and their sexual proclivity. And you can look at the animation or at the cartoon and decide for yourself by its graphic style what age people it's aimed at. So is this a bill to protect transsexual rights, or is it a bill to further a postmodern neo-Marxist agenda? Well, God only knows, but as far as I'm concerned, having analyzed the context within which this bill arose and within which it will be interpreted.
Bill C-16 purported to do nothing but extend human rights provisions to an excluded group, let's say, to the transgender and non-gender binary types, and that was the federal legislation. It also made it a hate crime to discriminate or harass, essentially. So now then the question is, well, what exactly do you mean by discriminate or harass? And why exactly is that a hate crime under the criminal code? Well, there was an answer to that. The answer was, well, this bill will be interpreted in light of the policies generated by the Ontario Human Rights Commission, a very large set of policies. Now, the Ontario Human Rights Commission is a radically leftist organization. I think it's the most dangerous organization in Canada, although you could debate that. And they set out all sorts of policies about how this legislation was going to be interpreted, and the federal government linked to their website to state that Bill C-16 would be interpreted in light of those guidelines. So I went and read all the policies. Well, one of the policies was that if you didn't use the preferred pronouns of a given group, that you could be charged essentially with a hate crime.
So the American Psychological Association announced in its guidelines for gender-affirming care that there were no valid long-term studies of the psychological consequences of transitioning. And they attributed that to the prejudice on the part of clinicians and researchers against the trans community, which is, of course, an absolutely preposterous accusation, but be that as it may. But then 3 or 4 pages later, they said, well, you know, the evidence is very clear that if you don't help people transition early, that their mental health outcome is much worse, including the risk for suicide. Now, both of those can't be true. We can't have an absolute dearth of long-term follow-up studies on the gender transformation front because of prejudice in the research field, and know without a doubt that youthful transition is the best pathway to mental health, which it most certainly and 100% is not. But that hasn't stopped idiot, coward psychiatrists, psychologists, social workers, etc., from saying such things to parents as, well, would you rather have a dead child or a live trans child. And so they put that at the feet of the parents, which is, well, if you object to this, then all you're doing is increasing the suicide risk for your troubled child, which is about as cruel a thing as you could possibly say to parents. I can't imagine something more manipulative, and also something so ungrounded in anything approximating clinical fact. Now, it is the case perhaps that a young woman who is troubled emotionally, who takes testosterone, might feel a momentary improvement in mood that's a consequence of the physiological effects of the testosterone. But there's no evidence whatsoever that that's actually linked to the gender transition process. Now, you don't see the same elevation in mood, by the way, as far as I've been able to tell from the research literature, in the case of boys who are transitioning to girls. And that also indicates that it's more than likely pharmacological. But it is the case that the medical profession, the counseling profession, has been enticed into this situation and also compelled by legislation, gender-affirming care legislation, to outright lie to parents about the relative risks. And you know, like I know, that these kids who are gender dysphoric, their underlying condition is something in the broader depression anxiety realm, and that the gender dysphoria is only it's a variant expression of that underlying broader psychopathology. We're making a big mistake in the modern world by elevating compassion to the, what would you call, status of unique virtue, because there's lots of other more primordial building blocks of virtue that are as important as compassion. So, for example, everyone's enjoined now to not be judgmental. And that really means to be casually dismissive, and I do think casually dismissive is a mistake. But judgmental, discriminating, that's not a mistake, that's a virtue. Because to be judgmental and to be discriminating means that you dispense with what isn't worthy, and you pursue what is worthy. And truthful is a virtue. And well, we can start with that. Sensitive to beauty is a virtue. All of those things have to be melded into higher order virtues, but compassion leaps out to dominate. And so it's easy to assume that if you're motivated by something like a reflexive compassion, that everything you think and want is therefore both good, practical, necessary, and morally justifiable. Worse than that, and this might be the most toxic element of it, is that if you believe that you're motivated by compassion, and compassion is the highest virtue, and then you run into anyone who opposes your views, then it's super easy to demonize them. And
yes,
that's also a huge problem. Now, I think that's rooted to some degree in the neurology of maternal compassion. So think about it this way. You know, when you're a mother of a young infant, you should be 100% compassionate. So let's say 0 to 6 months, because the infant is completely helpless. They can't move. So an infant can't be autonomous at all before that young person is capable of voluntary movement, right? So there's just no autonomy without voluntary movement. So till children can crawl, they're completely dependent on their mother. And what that means is their mother has to be 100% compassionate, because everything the child wants when it's in that infantile stage has to be dealt with no argument 100% of the time. And so, and more than that, so because the child is so vulnerable, the cost of labeling something as a predator that isn't a predator is very low. But the cost of labeling something that is a predator not a predator is very high. And so along with that overarching compassion comes this proclivity to over-label things as predatory. And that's protective, but it does not scale well into the political landscape. Imagine that you had a fictional identity for 15 years. That's approximately the same relative length of time. And the kids, you know, they weave up a fantasy world, and then they play out an identity in that. And then they weave out another fantasy world, and they play out an identity with that. And they shape that identity by their interactions with other children and adults. And hopefully they find an identity that suits them, that other people also accept. because your identity has to be something that other people accept or it isn't going to work for you. But that's all part of this exploration of who they could be. It's the play is, in fact, the exercising of that realm of possibilities. And so a good father, a good parent for that matter, but I think at least is an archetypally paternal role, puts a border of security around the child. And the mother might be inside that border of security when she has young children. And play can take place there. And the play is the investigation of multiple identities with the hope of finding one that is functional, that is also socially desired, because those things can't be dissociated. One of the reasons I think that the identity politics has bothered me so much, speaking of snitches, it's bothered me. It's like, this bothers me. And I've only recently realized that some of it had to do with what I saw as limitations on free speech, which is I have to say the words that, some authority or some population demands that I say, which I don't like. But there's something else too, which is that it's based on a very misleading theory of identity. Your identity is not just how you feel about yourself at this moment. And you can't impose that on other people because they don't know how to deal with that. Like, even if they wanted to, they wouldn't know the rules of the game. You have to negotiate your identity with other people. And so then you have to think of identity as something that's negotiated with other people. And so if you have an implicit theory of identity, like the one that seems to be increasingly dominating the cultural landscape, which is identity is something that's only subjectively determined and can also change from moment to moment, then you're misleading people as they develop because they come up with a very unsophisticated notion of what identity is. And that's not good because that's core. And part of your identity is your value to other people. That's a huge part of it. And that's not subjective. That's other people make that decision. I know many of my clinical colleagues and many clinicians around the world, and it's not as if they don't have more sophisticated theories of identity than those are being put forth by the gender ideologues. How the hell do you account for two things? I asked you this question earlier. The absolute capture of these once respectable institutions, which is appalling beyond comprehension, but also the unbelievable cowardice demonstrated by members of the psychiatric, psychological, and counseling communities. I mean, some of it's ignorance. You talk to counselors now and then who are so damn poorly educated that they buy the gender ideology. But there's the vast majority of well-trained clinicians are wise and perspicacious enough to know perfectly well that these identity theories are, to call them simplistic and diluted is barely to scratch the surface, but they're unbelievably timid about coming forward. And so what the hell happened? Like, how did this capture take place? And how do you account for this stunningly widespread dereliction of duty and utter cowardice? Well, identity, it would be useful to delve into that too, because people don't really understand what an identity does. And we have lapsed into this idiot subjectivity that's predicated on the assumption that you are whatever you feel. Now, first of all, that's a very bad measurement from a scientific or clinical perspective, because you never rely as a good clinician merely on what people feel. You need multiple converging sources of evidence to make a diagnosis. But the second part is more relevant, which is that your identity is actually a framework of attentional prioritization and action that enables you to function well in the natural and social environments. You could say the psychological, natural, and social environments. And what you feel you are is not going to be a useful identity if it's not integrated with other people. Piaget pointed out, for example, that developmental psychologists, that children have to integrate their ability to play in a social context. They have to negotiate an identity even when they're just playing a game with their friends. And identity itself is socially negotiated, which the lefties should know because they're all bang on about constructivism constantly. And so the idea that identity is only subjective and that it's only defined by what you feel is unethical. That's an unethical stance for clinicians to adopt, but it's also completely impractical because your identity is the game you play with your intimate partner. It's the game you play with your family. It's the game you play with your community. Like, you have to be nested socially at multiple levels of the social hierarchy in order to have a functional identity, and then to replace that with merely what you feel and to enforce that by fiat. Well, the only thing that could be more counterproductive than that is, as you pointed out, an identity that's only based on questioning, which is just a pathway to, existential angst and hopelessness.
Kids are confused enough when they're growing up. I think to add gender confusion to that, which we're doing very, very rapidly, is going to destroy 15 people for every one it saves. It might be more than that. Because there's plenty of confused people out there. I would say, 2 out of 30, something like that, are just barely clinging on to the edges of reality. And they're looking for acceptance and transmutation wherever they can find it. And confusing them further isn't going to help. And these people that were transitioning young, there's going to be one hell of a kickback from that, I can tell you, when they hit adulthood.
If the primary idea is that our society is an oppressive patriarchy, and I think that's number one idea, then anything that touches on that in any way immediately becomes untouchable. And so in order for the adults to make the decision, then you have to believe in authority, because the adults have the authority. And if you're going to believe that the adults have the authority, then you have to believe that hierarchy has some value. And then that tangles you up with your insistence that, hierarchy is definitely oppressive, and especially the Western form of hierarchy. And so I think that central axiom is so vital that anything that gets near it gets twisted and bent like it's too close to a gravitational field, and the logic is irrelevant, because that fundamental central issue has to be supported at all costs. So you can imagine the psychological impetus there is, if you make the initial assumption that there's a certain degree of innate pathological aggression associated with masculinity, and then you develop a counter theory that much of that is in fact socialized, then there's a route out of it, and that gives him, him an easy out. That's the thing, is that instead of having to contend with that internally, he can also externalize that and make that a sociological phenomena. I see this with the insistence on the trans activists' part that trans identity is much more common than it truly is, and that it's immoral to interfere with its manifestation. I see that as an extension of Freudian rationalization. If you've taken a dramatic route in your life, or something dramatic has happened to you, you have every reason to justify your decision post hoc. Not only do you see a gender difference, a sex difference at the chromosomal level, but you see it at the cellular level, and you see it at the level of systems of cells, correct, so organs. You see it at the level of broad physiology. We talked about lactation and menstruation, correct, and gestation, but there's the entire menstrual cycle. There's the completely different effect of hormones. All of that manifests itself in different perceptual patterns and in temperamental patterns that are sex typed to a large degree. And so the point here is that what constitutes sex is instantiated as part of identity at every single level of the hierarchies that people are embedded in, biologically and then also socially, because the social roles that are assigned to men and women are not merely arbitrary, right? I mean, part of what you see with parents is that the manner in which parents socialize their children is much more directed by the children than people had originally presupposed. And so parents who are establishing a genuine relationship with their children use the cues from the child's behavior to govern their interactions with the child. And so more feminine girls tend to be treated by their parents as more feminine creatures, and more masculine boys, etc. But the idea that that's all top-down socialization instead of bottom-up influence of biology is utterly preposterous, even though human beings are quite flexible in the manner in which they can be socialized.